So we're getting to a point now where we're happy with how the model's shaping up. We're happy with the scene, how the environment's going, etc. We can continue to work on these and tweak them as much as we like, right up until the point where we produce our final render. But for now, we're going to turn our attention to lighting this scene and getting it pretty much to the stage where we're ready to output our render passes and take it into our painting package, Photoshop, whatever you choose to use, and start playing around with compositing the final render. So we have our model. As you can see, I've added in some basic clouds in the background. The idea for these is they will be they'll be blurred, out of focus. So in the renders that I'm going to show you now, they'll be quite sharp, but we have to think ahead and think, right, even though they're sharp in this, we'll ignore them for now and we'll look ahead to how they're going to be in the final render. So let's just render the scene that we have now with just the default lighting, nothing fancy, and just with the shaders that we have been using all along. So this is just a quick render. I've added in a gradient in the background just so we have some colour there rather than the default grey. Again, this is just to give us more of an idea of how the overall scene's going to look, and just so we can check also how the colours of her dress, of her hair, etc. balance out with the colours in the background. Again, we can change the background later. This is just to give us an overall idea. So here we have the default lighting. Everything's looking a bit flat, a bit plasticky, very basic really. So we need to initially think about adding in a key light and giving this some shadows, which will also give depth to the scene, and it will plant a lot of these elements. So giving her shadows underneath her, for example, will sit her more on the rocks, whereas at the moment she could be just floating above them. And the same with her hair. We need some shadows coming from her hair onto her face. So if I have another scene set up already. I'll just open this scene. You'll have this as well. Don't want to save that. So here, just close this down. You'll see I've created one main light source. Now you could go down the route of the traditional 3 lights. Your key light, which casts the main light, a backlight which just gives a nice strong light to the back of the model and gives that sort of rim lighting effect, and then a fill light which just fills in those darker areas with a more subtle tone. But for this I'm just using one light, and that's the main light that's going to cast the shadows that we want. Again, I'm going to do another render, but what I'll do is we'll keep this one, and I'm just going to pause the video because this may take a little bit longer to render. So that's the render done with the main key light, and as you can see we've got some nice shadows being cast by everything. Now you can adjust the position of this light obviously to however you feel, but if we compare that with the default light which we saw before, as you can see we've added a lot more depth to the scene, and everything has just got that little bit more, looks that little bit more 3D, and the shadows just bring everything together as well. Now I've opted for a ray traced shadows just to make them a bit more precise, to be honest. And if I flick between the two here, you can just see how much it's added to the scene. But we can go further than this. Obviously we've got no backlighting yet, but I'll come to that in a moment. What we also want to add is a bit more lighting depth to the scene, and we can get that by using an ambient occlusion pass. Now what this will do is it will calculate, you set the background colour for your camera, and it basically, off that colour, it calculates sort of an ambient lighting. So as if the light was cast from above, you would get some natural shadows around everything as well as this hard shadow we've got from the light. The ambient occlusion will give us softer shadows and a more ambient shadow effectively. So again, I've got another scene set up. I'll just open this. So from here, it just looks exactly the same. We've got our key lighting as well. I've also added in a floor plane, and what this will do is it will add a bit more depth to our shadows, because the lights will be calculated from above and the photons will bounce off this floor plane here and back up to the model, telling it that this area under here needs to be in shadow because there's something underneath it. So again, I will pause the video while I render this, and then we can compare with what we had before. So this is render number 3. Now this has the main key light, which is giving us the main shadows, and a bit of ambient occlusion as well. And what I've done is I've made the ambient occlusion background colour just a pale blue to give us that sort of sky sort of colour. And as you can see, it's brightened up the scene overall, and it's only given us a subtle hint of the ambient occlusion. What we're going to do later is we will render out just a complete ambient occlusion pass, and then we can overlay that in Photoshop and play around with which areas are darker, which areas are lighter, etc. And it'll give the scene a lot more contrast and depth. Again, if I compare it with the one previously, remember this is just our key light, and I think the intensity of this light was only set to about 0.5 anyway. And to be honest, that's because I played around with it with the ambient occlusion, because the key light, if it's set to 1 and you have ambient occlusion as well, it could blow out the image. So I probably, in fact I did, I reduced the intensity of the key light in this scene to compensate. But like I say, you can see adding that ambient occlusion in with a hint of blue has just brightened up the scene, giving us a little bit of depth and contrast to it as well. So where can we go from here? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a backlight in the scene. And this is because I like to approach this in a different way. I like to put in a sort of fake rim lighting onto my shaders. And what this does is it gives you a lot more control over the colour of your backlighting and of how much backlighting or rim lighting you want per object or per shader. Whereas if we add a light in the background, that will affect all the objects the same and render them all exactly the same with the same amount, the same colour, etc. So again, I have a scene already set up. Rim lighting here. Just load that in. If I close this down, so you'll notice immediately that the model looks different, and that's because we have these ramp shaders on each model now, which helps us with the rim lighting. You'll have to excuse me, I'm trying not to go into specifics about how the rim lighting's set up in case you're not using Maya and you're using Softimage or 3ds Max or whatever. It's basically works off a facing ratio node, so which is piped into the shader via a ramp. So for the skin, for example, let me just show you actually. Rendering editors, hypershade. Now, like I say, you'll have to try and work this into different applications. So here's our skin shader. As you can see here, we have the ramp, which affects the rim, and it's only affecting the outer rim of the actual object. If I just graph that up. So what we have here is a facing ratio node, and what that does is whatever the camera is looking at, it works out sort of the edges of the model. So no matter where the camera is, this rim will always be around the edge of the model, and that goes into a ramp, which then goes into the color node. Now traditionally people use this and put it into the incandescence, but what I find is then that blows out the whole image and you end up with lighting in the darker areas or in the shadow areas, which you don't necessarily want. If I just bring up the attributes on this, so you can see the ramp, so it just goes into the colour channel, and this is all we have. We have our skin colour here, and we have our the ramp, or the colour that we want our rim light here. Now you can obviously pipe a texture into this as well, like we have done with the dress, etc. But that's basically how it's set up. Now, like I say, I'm trying to be as general as I can be without going into specifics. And as you can see, I've added it to all the objects. They've all got their own colours, their own amounts of how much the rim is going to affect each model. Just close that down. You'll also notice I've added this red plane here, and that is so the final gather will bounce off the bottom here, the ambient occlusion, and it will reflect a red light up under the rocks. Again, this is just an experiment, so right, again, I'll render this and then we can compare and we'll see how it looks. So here she is with the fake rim lighting applied, and as you can see, it's picked out a lot of the details around her arm here, and particularly the snails as well. If I just zoom in, you can see it's just picked up these lines around the edges of them and just brought them out of the image a little bit more. If I compare it with how it was before, you can see the rim lighting has just brightened everything up, and like I said, all these details are just popping out of the image now. I just flick between the two again, and also that red plane underneath has just added this red touch underneath here. Now it's important to remember that this is not the final render. This is it done. We're going to print it out and it's finished. This is just giving us the foundations to build upon. What we're going to do in the next stage is we'll take all our various render passes and combine them and then play around with them to add more depth to the image, add more texture, and just give it a lot more contrast and vibrancy, and just make it look a lot more interesting. But what you have here, if I go right back to the beginning, so we've basically gone from this, which was our default light, added in our key light, which gave us our shadow, added in some ambient occlusion to brighten up the image a little bit and give us some subtle depth and globally light the scene. And then we've added the rim lighting in, which has just brought out all the elements and just highlighted them in a way, and it's also given more depth to the image, and it's given it a more cartoony illustrative feel too. So from here to here, just by playing around with the lighting and adding in a few quick shader tricks. So like I say, what you need to do now is play around with the shaders to get all the skin tones, the stones, the right colours, even play around with the gradient in the background until you're completely happy with how the scene is looking. And then from there, it's a case of rendering out various render passes. Now each application does this in their own different way, but you essentially just want to set up a batch render. You want your main diffuse, which is just your base colours and textures, and then you want to render out an ambient occlusion pass, perhaps a shadow pass as well, reflection pass, because we've got reflections in her eyes and in the snail's eyes, and also strip down the shaders and render out a pass just with the rim lighting. So you just get the rim lighting on a black background. And again, we can take this into Photoshop. I keep saying Photoshop, but whatever application you're going to use, and overlay that. And what we can do with that then is, if there are any elements which we want to increase the rim lighting, like say around the face here, it's not as bright as we maybe want, we can use that layer to then just increase that on its own without editing anything else. One other pass that you need to render out is a selection pass, and I will show you that in the next video, but that is basically just every object with a different colour shader on, rendered out flat with no lighting information, and this just makes it easier for you to just select elements separately so that you can play around with the colours, the contrast, etc. Without affecting anything else. Like I say, I'll go over that in the next lesson. But for now, play around with the colours, the background and everything, the room lighting, and when you're happy, render out all your render passes, and we'll play around with those next.